Hello, my name is HPena, and welcome to my Week 6 presentation on selecting and sequencing student thinking. So for this presentation, I'm talking about how I use selecting and sequencing during a whole class discussion as a form of formative assessment. The main idea I focused on in this lesson is really treating student thinking as data, not just looking for correct answers. The task I used was the carnival probability task that we redesigned in week 3 and then implemented as the weeks went by, where students had to decide if a game was fair. As as I was teaching it, I was really paying attention to how students were reasoning, because that's really what drove the decisions I made during the discussion. This connected directly to William's idea of formative assessment and also the 5 practices, especially around selecting and sequencing student thinking. Let's dive in. So in this task, students were trying to figure out if a carnival game they created was fair by comparing experimental results to what they would expect theoretically. One thing I noticed pretty quickly was that my students approached this in very different ways. Some of them were using very small number of trials and jumping to conclusions. Others started to collect more data and look for patterns. A few students were even starting to connect that to theoretical probability. So right away, there was a range of thinking in the room, and so that really what I used to guide the discussions that we had. One of the pieces of student work I selected showed a student using a really small sample size and then deciding that the game was fair. At first, that might just look like a mistake, but as I looked around the classroom, I realized that this was actually a pretty common way students were thinking. I then, started seeing it in my algebra group again. Okay, I didn't obviously do this activity with them, but they did have to create a state presentation for the state of Texas, where they had to research something that they had an interest in, right? And so a lot of them were study time versus grades that they obtained, or they're athletes, so they focused on practice time versus game one. The big issues that they ran into when they were analyzing the linear regression was that their sample size was not adequate enough to make predictions, because the associations that they were seeing was almost no correlation whatsoever, or it was very, very weak, is what most of them got. And so a discussion, that led us to then talk about sample sizes. And so we had to close those misconceptions from 7th grade about making predictions from very, very small sample data, and how inaccurate it is to really categorize, you know, a an entire school based on 10 to 15 responses. Like, it's not very accurate. And so that's something that we did. But anyways, going back to this one here, it also matched in this probability activity. So I chose this example on purpose because it helped me get a better sense of what a lot of students were actually understanding. So instead of just correcting it, I used it to then surface that thinking for the whole classroom. And this connects to William's idea that we need better evidence about what students are thinking if we want to make better instructional decisions. So why does selecting matter? Selecting, this type of work really changed the direction of the discussion. So instead of focusing only on correct answers, it let me bring out a misconception that a lot of my students were actually having. This helped me see patterns in thinking across the class, and not just individual responses. So instead of just shutting down that misconception, I instead used it as a starting point for discussion. So my main goal here wasn't just to fix the error, but to understand how my students were reasoning, and then we built from there. So after selecting student responses, I then sequenced them in a very, very intentional way. So how did I do that? Well, I started with the misconception, right? Because a lot of students could relate to it. Then we moved into a strategy where students had collected more data and were starting to see patterns. Finally, we looked at a response where the students connected everything to theoretical probability. This order, I felt, really helped because students could see how thinking developed step by step. So for my students that were struggling, it made the idea more accessible instead of just jumping straight to the most complex explanation, right? Because that really helps nobody. So as we went through the strategies, it really started to build a storyline across the discussion. Students weren't just seeing different answers. Instead, they were seeing how ideas connected and then improved over the time. So you could actually hear students responding to each other and adjusting to their thinking. That's really what the five practices talk about, building a coherent mathematical storyline instead of just sharing random strategies that students can then or struggle to apply to other content. So, and I would then see my students starting to make those connections on their own, which was very, very powerful to see. At one point, I did pause and I asked a hinge question about whether the game was actually fair based on what we had seen so far. So instead of just calling on a few students, I had everyone respond using finger voting. This gave me a quick picture of how the entire class was thinking, not just the students who usually participate, right? And so that was important because sometimes the students who volunteer don't really represent what the rest of the class is thinking, which again is very common across many, many classrooms. So when I looked at the responses, it helped me see that some students were still not fully understanding. This decision was based on the evidence from all students, not just those that spoke up, like I mentioned. So because of that, I adjusted the lesson in the moment. We paused, and I had students talk through their thinking with a partner, and then we revisited the data to make the patterns clearer. So that moment really showed the balance between the planning and the responding. So even though I had a sequence in mind, I couldn't just move forward if my students weren't ready, right? And that's something that we see in the daily. So I do stay super late on campus because of this issue. I might have planned something and I had a sequence for it, but then boom, students come in and real time, plans usually get interrupted. So we have to be adaptable on the spot, make those instructional decisions, the adjustments that are needed, and then shift focus so that we can all go back to the same page and then, move forward. So instead of just sticking to the plan, like I said, I adjusted based on what students actually needed, and that's really what formative assessment looks like in practice, right? And it's nice to talk about it out loud and how it works. Another thing I noticed is that this approach really supported participation across the class. Students who might not normally speak up were still contributing uh, through the whole class responses. And because we were using different type of student work, more students saw that their thinking reflected in the discussion. So this helped create a space where students were more comfortable sharing and then building on ideas, right? And then something that I learned through a PD that I went to a couple weeks ago was we understand that we want them to share their reasoning and their thinking with other students, but again that comes back to, do the students feel confident enough to do so? So we start with very, very low stakes, sometimes non-related content questions. So one of the things that I started implementing was asking a question on what's the favorite city that you want to visit. If you don't like, if money is not an issue, where would you want to go visit? And so I would have it write it on their work, um, and additionally, and then have them pair up with somebody who might have put the same thing. So it's like a stand up, hand up, pair up kind of strategy. And then they first start by discussing what city they wanted to go to. So it can take 30 seconds just to, I guess, dissolve the walls of speaking, because it's very low stake, right? They're just sharing what city they want to go to, and then they learn from each other. And then from there, we build on, okay, let's go to the content. And so by that time, the discourse is doesn't feel as putting a spotlight on you, because they already had that friendlier conversation before, and so they built a rapport with each other. So it's something, that I implemented, that I liked, and it's very, the students did accept it, and they enjoyed it as well. So it's something I will be using moving forward. So, anyways, overall, the lesson really reinforced that student thinking should drive instruction, right? Which is key. So, selecting helped me decide which ideas I would bring forward, while sequencing helped me organize those ideas into something meaningful. The hinge question helped me decide whether I needed to adjust instruction, which the answer was yes. So instead of just delivering the lesson as planned, I was making decisions based on what my students were actually understanding. And that will conclude my presentation. And again, these ideas were grounded in Williams' work on formative assessment and Smith and Stein's five practices framework, both of which emphasize student thinking to guide instruction. And of course, the images were gathered online through the Creative Commons licensing. And I thank you for watching my presentation. We'll see you on the next one. Bye bye.